In this case, the defendant was drunk when he got into his car, and has an accident and causes the victim not to die, but to have some very very serious injuries. And so the defendant in this case of McHale is charged with aggravated assault. And what's nice about this case is how the court talks about how this case is effectively, or how aggravated assault is effectively third degree murder without the death, but with some serious bodily injury that occurs. That the same malice standard that we're using for third degree murder, we're using for aggravated assault, and so we can cross pollinate our cases that define malice in one context from the cases that define malice in the other. And what you see in this case is what we've been talking about all along, that there are definitely cases in which courts have said that in Pennsylvania and other places as well, but we're looking obviously in this class at Pennsylvania because it's for the jurisdiction where most of you will practice. That there are cases where the court has said that this is not enough for malice. It's a question of degree. So the court has said that merely causing an accident with your car that leads to a death or serious bodily injury, that could just be simple negligence. And then even when we take that to the level of DUI, that because it's mere happenstance, whether someone gets injured from your DUI, that wouldn't be enough to show the degree of evil, if you will, the degree of culpability that's somehow analogous to what we think of when we think of third degree murder. And it's very interesting that the court in this case cites the model penal code which says that there are degrees of recklessness that we couldn't meaningfully distinguish from an intentional killing. And therefore we're almost looking for that degree of awfulness, that your degree of recklessness was so bad we can't really distinguish it from an intentional killing. You're going to want to rewind this tape a couple times because that's a really big concept. Go back and read it in the case. The court is citing the model penal code for the proposition that third degree murder ought to be regarded as the same as first degree murder. And of course, Pennsylvania doesn't do that. And there's a very big distinction between first degree murder and third degree murder in Pennsylvania. The model penal code made no distinction between any degrees of murder, and it left the sentencing to the judge, but regarded malice murder to be equivalent to an intentional murder, but then left a wide range of sentencing to the judge. That's what the professors who wrote the model penal code recommended, and that very few states adopted. But the court is saying that we ought to be looking for the degree of recklessness that shows a disregard for human life that comes very, very close to an intentional killing. Okay, fine. But the problem is we're still talking about recklessness. We're still talking about this very malleable, squishy term. What do we do with it? Well, what we've been doing all along, which is to say that there are certain things like a single punch, like a DUI that merely crosses the line to 0.08, that then leads to a death, that simple speeding, 10 miles an hour over the speed limit that leads to a death. That doesn't feel like anything approximating the most serious forms of homicide, which, of course, we are learning that aggravated assault is simply regarded as that without the death, but with serious bodily injury. So does that mean then that like bar fights that lead to deaths or punches that lead to deaths could never be third degree murder or aggravated assault? Absolutely not. Does that mean that DUIs that lead to serious bodily injury or to death could not be aggravated assault or third degree murder? Absolutely not. But what you see in this case is that this is, again, regarded as a question of degree. The court talks about the drag racing, or the case of the guy who was driving drunk, who then continued to go after the guy hit the top of his car. And the court doesn't talk about that and talk about it in these cases, but there are cases throughout the country that look at your degree of intoxication, your speed, the extent to which you are violating driving laws, and indeed the number of prior DUI convictions you have, to determine where you are on this continuum between involuntary manslaughter and malice murder. So, as you would expect, the greater your degree of intoxication, the greater your speed, et cetera, et cetera. So all this case really tells us is that there are cases where you are simply drunk, where you are simply speeding, that will not amount to either aggravated assault if the person is seriously injured, or to malice murder if the person is killed, if the victim is killed. Where does that leave us? That leaves us with the idea that there will be cases in which there is a differentiation. If the indictment alleges 0.08 blood alcohol level, defendant was following all applicable traffic laws, defendant or victim steps out in front of him, he could have stopped if he'd been sober, didn't, and the indictment alleges third-degree murder, that indictment will be dismissed at the pretrial stage if the defense brings a motion to dismiss it. But let's say it's 0.18 and he's 25 miles an hour over the limit, and it's his second DUI. Well, that's too squishy. We're not going to know what's going to happen in that case. We know what all the relevant factors are. We know this is worse than the entry-level DUI, and we know it's not as bad as it possibly could be. That's that middle zone. And there are a few markers in the road. There are a few places where the courts will stake their flag and say, this is not third-degree murder. The bare entry into speeding, the bare entry into DUI, clearly not. But as you get more drunk and as you get faster, as you get more reckless, you may well trip into malice, which can then either be aggravated assault or third-degree murder. And what this case nicely does is it tells us that we can look for these indications of malice in both the aggravated assault cases as well as in the homicide cases.